My daughter-in-law looked across the table at her guests and smiled. "We've made arrangements for Margaret," she said. "She doesn't need to worry about any of it anymore." I was sitting 3 feet away from her. I had my hands folded in my lap. No one looked at me. I set my fork down very quietly, pushed back my chair, and picked up my coat from the hook by the door. My son called after me from the hallway. I heard him, but I didn't stop. Outside, the November air hit my face like cold water, and I stood on the front step of the house I'd helped pay to renovate and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. I hadn't cried. I didn't feel like crying. I felt something else, something older and quieter. Like a door inside me had swung open after years of being wedged shut. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, sat down on the bench, and waited. The city was still doing what cities do. Taxis passed. Someone walked a dog in a plaid jacket. A streetlight buzzed above me. The world had no idea what had just cracked clean through inside me. That was the night I started becoming myself again. Let me go back a little, because the evening I just described didn't happen without years behind it. Things like that never do. I spent 31 years as a bookkeeper. I worked for a small manufacturing firm outside of Hamilton, and I was good at my job. Numbers made sense to me in a way people sometimes don't. I understood ledgers. I understood accounts. I understood exactly what it meant when the columns didn't balance. I retired at 63, not because anyone pushed me out, but because my husband Frank had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I wanted time with him while we still had it. We had 2 children, Daniel, our son, who became an engineer and moved to Toronto, and our daughter Patricia, who everyone called Patty, who died of ovarian cancer at 44. Patty's death changed everything. I don't say that as a figure of speech. I mean it literally. It changed the composition of every room I walked into, every phone call I made, every quiet Sunday. She'd been the one who came home for no reason just to sit in the kitchen with me. She'd been the one who called after every doctor's appointment, not to report, just to listen. Frank died 14 months after Patty. Some people said the grief did it. I don't know. I think the Parkinson's did it, and the grief didn't help. Either way, within 2 years, I had lost both of them. I had Patty's daughter, though. My granddaughter Claire, who was 19 when Patty died, and came to stay with me for 3 weeks afterward. She slept in the guest room and made me eat breakfast every morning, even when I told her I wasn't hungry. She'd come back from the corner store with those little blueberry muffins I like, and set one on the table beside my coffee without saying a word. That's the kind of person she is. She notices without making a production of it. And I had Daniel, my son, my firstborn, a man I raised to be kind, who somewhere along the way had learned to mistake efficiency for care. It started small, the way it always does. After Frank died, Daniel suggested I sell the house in Ancaster. "Too big for one person," he said. "Too much maintenance. The furnace was old. The roof had 5 years left on it at best." He wasn't wrong about any of it. I sold it and moved into a condo in Burlington. Smaller, yes, but mine. I used the proceeds to top up my RRSP and put a portion in a TFSA I managed myself. I wasn't wealthy, but I was careful. 31 years of bookkeeping had made sure of that. The condo was where I started to feel settled again. I had a small balcony facing west, and I'd sit out there in the evenings watching the lake go orange in the distance. I joined a book club at the library. I took a watercolor class on Wednesday afternoons. A woman named Helen in the class had a laugh that could embarrass pigeons, and she became one of the easiest friends I'd had in years. Then Sasha started calling more often. She and Daniel had been married for 9 years by then. She was organized, competent, the kind of woman who sends calendar invites for casual dinners. I respected her ability to manage things. I just didn't realize, for a long time, that she had also started managing me. It crept in the same way it always does. One winter, she offered to set up automatic bill payments for my condo fees. "I travel on icy roads," she said, "and you don't have to bother." Then she offered to handle my cable and internet renewals because she was already on the phone with the provider for their account anyway. Then Daniel suggested, gently, that it might make sense to add him as a joint account holder to one of my bank accounts, just in case something happens. You know how it is, Mom. I knew how it was. I'd seen it in the ledgers of the firm I worked at for 3 decades. The slow, polite redistribution of authority. It never announces itself. It just rearranges until one day you go looking for something and find it's already been moved. I said yes to the joint account. I told myself I was being practical. That spring, they began talking about me moving in with them. They had a house in Etobicoke with a finished basement suite, separate entrance, its own bathroom, a little kitchenette. Independent, they called it. Private. And it would help them too, Sasha said, because their daughter Emma was 8 and needed consistency after school. Not help with childcare exactly, she said carefully, just having family around. I thought about the balcony and the watercolor class and Helen's laugh. I thought about how I had only just started to feel like myself again after years of grief and hospital corridors. And then I thought about Emma, my granddaughter, who had brown eyes exactly like Frank's and always fell asleep in the car. I moved in October. The suite was nice. I mean that honestly. Freshly painted, good windows, a small herb garden out the back door that Sasha had planted and told me to water. What changed wasn't the space. What changed was the rhythm of the house above me. Within a month, I was picking up Emma from school every day. I didn't mind it at first. I loved Emma. I still do. But it became assumed rather than asked, and those are 2 very different things. By March, I was also making dinner 2 or 3 nights a week because Sasha was working late and Daniel's commute ran long. By summer, I was managing the grocery orders because I was home and it was easier. I told myself I was contributing. I told myself it was good to feel useful. I stopped going to the watercolor class because the timing didn't work anymore. I saw Helen for coffee twice over 6 months. The book club I let lapse because I was always tired by evening. There were smaller things, too, the kind that don't sound like much when you say them out loud. Sasha would talk over me in conversations. Not rudely, not loudly, just consistently. The way you stop noticing a clock ticking until someone asks you if you can hear it. Daniel would suggest things with a tone that had no room for refusal. It wasn't unkindness. It was the assumption that they had already decided, and I would come around. My opinions were received the way you receive unsolicited advice, with a polite nod and no actual consideration. I started spending more time in the suite. I told myself I preferred the quiet. What happened at the dinner was this. Daniel and Sasha had invited 2 of their friends over, a couple named Gordon and Wren, who I had met twice before. Nice people. We were having roast chicken and Sasha's salad, which she made with that dressing she orders online from a company in Vancouver. It was a normal Friday night. Emma had eaten earlier and was upstairs. Gordon worked in financial planning. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, the conversation turned to retirement planning, to the recent changes in RRSP conversion rules, to estate planning for aging parents. The topic arrived the way these things do at dinner tables, without invitation, and then Sasha set down her wine glass and said it, pleasantly, conversationally, looking directly at Gordon as though she were citing a useful fact. "We've already made arrangements for Margaret," she said. "She doesn't need to worry about any of it anymore. Daniel handles her accounts, and we've got a power of attorney drafted. She's all looked after." Gordon nodded. Wren smiled at me with the particular warmth people reserve for the elderly and the very young. And I, who had spent 31 years managing other people's money, who could read a balance sheet the way most people read a menu, who had restructured my own finances after Frank died and made decisions that had kept me solvent and independent for 6 years, sat at that table and was described as someone who didn't need to worry anymore. I hadn't signed any power of attorney. Daniel had mentioned it once. I had not responded. I set my fork down. I picked up my coat. I left. On the bus, I took out my phone and opened the banking app. The joint account showed a transfer I hadn't made, $200 3 weeks ago to an account I didn't recognize. Small enough to miss. The kind of thing that doesn't look like anything until you're looking for it. I looked out the window at the night passing and thought about the first time Patty called me from the hospital after her diagnosis. She'd been so matter-of-fact on the phone. She'd said, "I need you to know everything, Mom. No softening it. I'm a grown woman, and I want to understand what's happening." She had been 42. She had fought for her own clarity until the very end. I thought about what she would say to me if she'd watched the last 2 years happen. She'd have raised one eyebrow and asked, very quietly, why I'd been so quiet. I got home to my suite, made chamomile tea, and sat at the small kitchen table with a legal pad. I started making a list. The next morning, I called my own bank. Not the joint account, my personal savings, the one in my name alone, the TFSA, the RRSPs. I confirmed balances. I changed my online password to something only I would know. I requested that the joint account authorization on the checking account be reviewed. Then I called Claire. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does. Grandma. Her voice was the same as it's always been with me, warm and completely without performance. I told her what had happened at the dinner. I told her about the transfer I'd found. I told her I was done. She didn't try to soften it or explain it away. She said, "Tell me what you need." That was enough. I want to pause here and say something, because I've been sitting with this for a while and I think it matters. Daniel is not a bad man. I want to be very clear about that. He is not malicious. He did not wake up one morning and decide to diminish me. But there is a kind of harm that comes without intention, and it is no less real for the absence of malice. The slow accumulation of being managed, redirected, spoken over, decided for it compounds. And the worst part is that it makes you feel ungrateful for noticing, because no single thing is bad enough to name. But I was a bookkeeper for 31 years. I understand that you cannot look at one line item in isolation. You have to look at the full ledger. The full ledger did not balance. I spent the next week doing what I should have done from the beginning. I booked an appointment with a lawyer downtown, a woman named Andrea Forsyth, who had been recommended to me by Helen, whose own mother had gone through something similar. Andrea had short gray hair, and the kind of directness I find enormously comforting. She asked me questions and wrote down the answers without fuss. I told her I wanted to understand where I stood legally. I told her that a power of attorney had been mentioned to me, but that I had not signed one. She confirmed that without my signature, nothing was binding. She explained, clearly and without condescension, what a power of attorney actually meant under Ontario law, who could hold it, what they could and couldn't do, and how to ensure it never went to anyone without my explicit, documented, witnessed consent. Then I told her about the RRSP and TFSA, my retirement income, my CPP and OAS, which I'd been receiving for 4 years. All of it was mine. I had been managing it competently before Daniel suggested he could help, and I was fully capable of continuing to do so. "I'd like to revoke the joint account authorization," I told her. "Done," she said. "And I'd like to have a will drawn up that I've reviewed personally." I had one, but it was outdated. I wanted to look at it with someone who would explain every line. She opened her calendar. We made 2 more appointments. On the way home, I stopped at the Tim Hortons on Bloor and sat in the window with a large coffee and a maple dip, and I watched people walk by in their coats and their scarves, and I thought about how strange it is that reclaiming something you were never supposed to lose feels so much like courage. 2 weeks after the dinner, Daniel came down to the suite. He knocked, which he didn't always do. I let him in. He sat on the edge of the couch the way he used to sit on the end of his bed when he was a teenager, and had done something he couldn't quite bring himself to explain. He is 60 years old. He still sits that way when he's uncomfortable. He said he'd heard from the bank. I told him I had made some changes. He rubbed the back of his neck. He said Sasha had meant well. He said they'd been trying to protect me. He said things had gotten complicated after his father died and someone had to step in. I asked him when he'd started seeing complicated and me as synonymous. He didn't answer. I hadn't expected him to. I told him about the unauthorized transfer, not accusingly, calmly, the way I would have told an employee there was a discrepancy in their expense report. He looked genuinely startled. He said he'd have to talk to Sasha about it. I believed him that he didn't know. I also believed that not knowing wasn't the same as not being responsible. I told him I loved him. I told him I was glad he was my son. I told him that nothing about what I was doing was meant to punish him. But I also told him the truth. I said, "You stopped asking what I wanted a long time ago and you started deciding instead. And I let you, because I was lonely and tired and I missed your father and I wanted to feel like I still had a family. But I am 68 years old. I am not done. I am not fragile. And I am not something to be arranged." He looked at the floor. His jaw moved a little. I gave him time. Eventually, he looked up and said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I nodded. I said I knew. What I didn't say, because it wasn't the right moment, was that sorry is the beginning of something, not the end, that I would need to see what came after it. That words are nice, but I've worked with numbers long enough to know that what you measure is what matters. I spoke to Sasha the following day. She came to the suite at my invitation, which was already different from how things usually went. She sat across the table from me with her hands wrapped around a mug and her shoulders set high the way they get when she feels challenged. I didn't want a fight. I've never wanted one. I said what I needed to say plainly and without heat. I told her that I understood she had good intentions. I told her I didn't doubt that she loved Daniel and wanted to protect their family. I told her that I was part of that family and not something to be protected from my own life. She started to explain the dinner. I held up one hand. I said, "When you told Gordon and Wren that arrangements had been made for me, without my knowledge and without my consent, you announced to a room full of people that I no longer required consultation about my own affairs. Whether you meant to or not, that is what you said. And I need you to understand why that cannot happen again." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she hadn't thought of it that way. I believe her. That's the hard part. I believe she genuinely hadn't. I think some people manage because they cannot bear disorder. I think control, for some people, is a form of love, but it stops being love when the person being managed has no say in whether they want it. That's just management. We didn't hug when she left, but she thanked me for being direct. That felt like something. Emma came down to see me that evening. She was in her pajamas with a library book under her arm. She asked if I was mad at her mom. I said no. I said her mom and I were figuring something out. I said that sometimes grown-ups have to have hard conversations to understand each other, and that's not the same as being angry. She thought about this. She asked if she could still come down and do puzzles with me on Saturdays. "Always," I said. "That doesn't change." She nodded very seriously and went back upstairs. "I want to tell you about the appointment with Andrea when we finalized the will." It was a Thursday afternoon in January, one of those days in Ontario when the cold is absolute and the sky is a flat white that offers nothing. I wore my good wool coat, the navy one I bought, the Winter Frank, and I went to see the lights in Quebec City, our last real trip together. He'd said I looked like a professor in it. I'd said he looked like a man who'd never had to shop for himself, which was true. Andrea spread the documents on the desk the way lawyers do, with an orderly reverence for paper. She walked me through every clause. She'd redrafted the will to reflect what I actually wanted, which was simple. My estate, modest but real, would go to Claire and to a small bursary I wanted to establish at the Hamilton Public Library in Patty's name. A fund for girls between 12 and 18 to access art classes and programming. Something Patty would have loved. Something I wanted to exist in the world with her name on it. Daniel was still in the will. A portion of it. I'm his mother. That doesn't disappear because things became difficult. But Claire was named executor, because Claire is the person who will carry out my wishes with care and without agenda. When I signed my name, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt accurate, like I had finally corrected a long series of entries that had slowly drifted from the truth. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk and watched the afternoon go. I thought about Patty. I often do. I thought about how she'd been at every important moment in my life, with a particular quality of presence. Not loud, not large, just there. A hand on a shoulder, a muffin on a table, a voice on the other end of the phone that already knew what you needed before you said it. She'd been gone for 6 years. I still talk to her sometimes, not out loud, just in the way you carry someone, in the particular weight of them. I said, "I'm figuring it out, Pat. I know I'm late to some of this." The wind picked up off the street, and I started walking toward the subway, and it felt exactly like someone had walked beside me for half a block. Claire came to visit the following weekend. She drove up from Guelph on a Saturday morning with a bag full of groceries and that particular expression she gets when she is trying not to make a fuss. She'd bought ingredients for the cheddar and leek soup I used to make on cold weekends when Patty was alive, the one that takes an hour to do properly and fills the whole place with something that smells like being home. We cooked it together in my small kitchen. She chopped. I sautéed. At some point, she said, "I keep expecting to hear Aunt Patty come through the door." "I know," I said. "I still do too." She was quiet a moment. "She'd be proud of you, you know." I told her I wasn't sure proud was the right word. Maybe relieved. Claire laughed, which sounded enough like Patty's laugh that I had to focus on the onions for a minute. We ate at the table with the good bowls, the ones I'd brought from the house in Ancaster that had been my mother's, cream-colored with a small blue rim, chipped in places but still whole. We didn't talk about Daniel or Sasha for most of the meal. We talked about Claire's job at the university library, about a man she'd been seeing who apparently had opinions about jazz that she found both irritating and compelling, about whether I'd ever go back to the watercolor class. "I think I might," I said. "I've been thinking about it." "You should," she said. "You were good." I told her I was intermediate at best. She told me intermediate was good. We argued about this pleasantly for a while. Before she left, she helped me move the bookshelf to the wall by the window where the afternoon light hits it. We'd been meaning to do it for weeks. When we were done, she stood back and looked at the room the way you look at something when it's finally right. "Better," she said. Yes, I agreed. Much better. After she left, I sat in the chair by the rearranged bookshelf and read for 2 hours. Not the same paragraph 4 times, the whole chapter, properly. I'd forgotten how a good book changes the texture of an afternoon. I want to tell you about Helen, because Helen deserves to be in this story. I called her the week after the dinner and told her the whole thing. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Helen, who has opinions and is not shy about sharing them. When I finished, she said, "Well, it took you long enough to get angry." I told her I wasn't angry. I was clear. She said that was better anyway. We started meeting for coffee again, Tuesdays at the cafe near the library. She'd taken up ceramics, which surprised me. She kept bringing me small lopsided bowls she'd made, which I placed on the windowsill and found myself genuinely fond of. There is something about an object made by hand that a person who loves you holds a particular warmth in it, even when it's not quite even. In March, she told me the watercolor class had a new session starting. "Come back," she said. "Pam still asks about you." I went back the following Wednesday. Pam, who runs the class, hugged me like I'd returned from somewhere difficult, which I suppose I had. I painted a lemon tree that first session. It wasn't very good. It didn't matter. Spring came the way it does in Ontario reluctantly, and then all at once, the small herb garden behind the suite began to show green again. I'd planted dill and chives the previous year and assumed they hadn't survived the winter, but they had. Things do sometimes, in ways you don't expect. I'd been in the suite for 18 months by then. I'd thought, over the winter, that I might eventually look for my own place again, a small apartment somewhere. Somewhere I could have a balcony or a decent window facing west. The thought of it was both appealing and frightening in equal parts. Appealing because I knew what it felt like to have my own space. Frightening because I was 68 and had just watched a year of my life blur by in someone else's house. But the thought kept returning, the way good thoughts do, persistent and quiet. I started looking online in April. Nothing urgent, just looking. Burlington again, or maybe Oakville. I liked the lake. I liked being close enough to Helen and the watercolor class that I didn't have to rearrange everything again. One evening, Emma came down and found me on the laptop looking at listings. She sat beside me and looked at the photos with the gravity that 9-year-olds apply to things they find important. "Are you moving?" she asked. I told her I was thinking about it. She looked at the screen for a moment. "Would you still come to my school things?" I told her of course I would. That I lived around the corner or 20 minutes away didn't change that I was her grandmother. She leaned against my arm briefly. "I want you to be happy," she said, with the uncomplicated sincerity of children. "Mom says you've been sad." I thought about that. I told her I hadn't been sad so much as I'd been small, and that I was working on being bigger again. She seemed to accept this as a reasonable explanation. Then she asked if I had any of the shortbread left from Christmas. I did not, as it turned out. But I had crackers and brie, which we ate together at the kitchen table while she told me at length about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend over something involving a project about wolves. I listened carefully. I offered what I hoped was useful counsel. She thanked me with the formality she uses when she's being sincere. After she went back upstairs, I sat for a while in the quiet. I thought about the words Sasha had used that night at the dinner. Arrangements. "We've made arrangements for Margaret." As though I were an event that needed coordinating. I thought about the woman I'd been before I moved in. The one who managed her own accounts and knew exactly what was in every column. The one who went to book club and painted badly on Wednesday afternoons and had a friend who made her laugh loudly in public places. I hadn't been young. I hadn't been carefree. But I'd been the author of my own days. That woman hadn't left. She'd just gotten very quiet. Quiet enough that I'd almost forgotten to listen for her. I found an apartment in May, second floor of a building in Oakville, half a block from the lake. The windows faced southwest, and the light in the afternoon was exactly what I'd been missing. The landlord was a quiet man named David, who shook my hand and told me the previous tenant had stayed for 11 years. I took that as a good sign. I told Daniel and Sasha over dinner, not as an announcement requiring approval, but as a fact I was sharing because we were family and they deserved to know. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is this about what happened?" "It's about what I want," I told him. "Those two things aren't the same." Sasha asked if there was anything they could help with, not managing the process, just help. I said yes. I said Claire was coming to help me move, and that if Daniel wanted to come carry boxes, I'd appreciate it and I'd feed him lunch. He came. He carried boxes without comment. He ate the sandwiches I made. When the last box was in, and Claire and I were standing in the empty suite looking at the place where my bookshelves had been, he hugged me in the doorway longer than he usually does. I hugged him back. Some things take time. I'm not in a hurry. The apartment took a week to feel like mine, and then it did, the way places do when you arrange them to suit yourself. I put the cream-colored bowls in the kitchen cabinet where I could see them. I hung the small print Claire had given me, a painting of a lakeshore at dusk, above the writing desk. I put Patty's photograph on the windowsill, beside the chives I'd brought in a pot from the herb garden. I booked back into the watercolor class for the fall session. I called Helen to tell her the new address, and she said she'd be over Thursday with wine and her most recent lopsided bowl, which turned out to be slightly more lopsided than the others, but the right shade of blue. One evening in June, I sat on the small balcony with a book and a glass of iced tea and watched the lake go gold in the early evening. It was a Tuesday. Nobody needed anything from me. My accounts were in order. My will reflected my actual wishes. My granddaughter was coming Sunday to go to the farmer's market. I thought about all the things I'd let happen slowly over 2 years, and I tried to find the right word for how I felt about it. Not regret, exactly. Something more like recognition. I had been a woman who understood how things add up. I had let myself not look at the ledger, and when I finally looked, the number was clear. You cannot get those 2 years back, but you can decide what the next ones look like. I picked up my book and read until the light was gone, and the city across the water was all lit up and faint on the horizon. Then I went inside, locked the door of my own apartment, and made myself dinner. A proper one, with the good dishes, eaten at the table, with no one telling me where I was supposed to sit. If you're watching this and something in it sounded familiar, I want to ask you something. Not for me, but for yourself. When was the last time someone asked you what you wanted, and you answered honestly? When did you last sit at a table you'd set yourself and eat without waiting for permission? Because I promise you, it doesn't have to be dramatic. You don't have to carry a roast out the front door. You just have to start looking at the ledger. And when you do, you'll know exactly what needs to be corrected. That's all anyone needs. Just the truth, and the willingness to balance it.